Hello and welcome to Capitol Hill. I'm Lyndal Curtis. The announcement Gina Rhinehart had upped her stake in the Fairfax company and the resultant push for seats on the board has had reverberations in federal politics. The acting Prime Minister says the government would be very concerned if Ms Rhinehart wants to buy influence and junk Fairfax's Charter of Editorial Independence. The Greens want that charter legislated and one Labor MP wants much tougher regulation for the media. Joining me today to discuss this and other issues are two senators, Labor's Doug Cameron and Michaelia Cash from the Liberals. First to Fairfax, and the Communications Minister, Stephen Conroy, has ruled out agreeing to the Greens' push to legislate Fairfax's independence charter.
It is an anxious time for many Fairfax workers, and what we are not going to do is start legislating to interfere in any way with editorial independence. At the moment, people should be focused on wanting to ensure the maximum support for Fairfax workers and their families. My colleague, Mr Shorten's department, have been in touch with Fairfax and we're talking to the company about how the government can assist. But in terms of legislating an editorial position, the answer is no.
Doug, Wayne Swan says the government concerned the independence charter might be junked. If you are concerned, why aren't you willing to put it into legislation?
Well, the first issue is the issue of 1,900 workers who've lost their jobs, and I'm concerned about that. And I have to say that the performance from the coalition yesterday, using those workers as pawns in their fear campaign against the carbon tax, was one of the most unedifying things I've seen in Parliament. But no, we shouldn't legislate. The public will make a determination if Gina Rhinehart tries to turn the Sydney Morning Herald and the Age into some American right-wing rag, and I don't think they'd buy it.
Just so you mentioned the issue of concern about the jobs, I did raise with the panellists yesterday. The government hasn't rushed in with a rescue package or assistance package for either the journalists or printers as it has with other workers. Should it do that?
Well, no, I don't think so. The issue is that this company has about $1.5 billion of revenue. I think they've got about 500 million earnings before tax. They are not a company that's on its knees. This is a company that's still doing pretty well. They are making some strategic decisions in relation to the changing technology. And I don't think the government coming in and doing anything would be the issue. I think who should be doing something is Gina Rhinehart. If she wants to be on the board, then she should be making sure that the wealth of the mining sector does get shared around to workers who are losing their jobs, and she's shown no signs of that.
Michaelia, the Independence Charter was adopted by the board of Fairfax, so it's not just something that the journalists push for. If Gina Rhinehart wants seats on the board, should she agree to uphold that charter?
Lyndal, let's be clear about two things here. Mrs Rhinehart is completely entitled to buy shares in Fairfax. It is a publicly listed company, just as you, myself or Senator Cameron could. The board of Fairfax is completely entitled to ask Mrs Rhinehart to sign the Charter of Independence. The question Australians need to ask themselves, however, is this. If Mrs Rhinehart does indeed sign the Charter of Independence, should Mr Murdoch sign a Charter of Independence? Should your local editor down in a rural part of New South Wales sign a Charter of Independence? Or maybe we should extend it to the Fairfax employees. They might like to sign a charter declaring that they will provide balanced and unbiased coverage.
But this charter was adopted by staff as well, so presumably they're already signed up to it.
Well, one would say, based on their reporting, one would often question that. But look, this is an issue between Fairfax and Mrs Rhinehart, and I think it's very convenient of the government, who clearly dislike Mrs Rhinehart, to want to step in here and muddy the waters. The opposition believes in freedom of the press, and in no way do we want to interfere in what is a matter between Mrs Rhinehart and Fairfax.
Doug, Michaelia raises the point about why doesn't Rupert Murdoch sign a Charter of Independence. Your side of politics has often had problems with the Murdoch press that you say are biased towards the right wing. Why not insist on a Charter of Independence for News Limited as well?
I've described them as a threat to democracy, and I still think that's the position. I think democratic processes are not assisted when you've got these billionaires trying to control the media message to the public And, you have to go back to the 60s when Lang Hancock, this is really unfinished Hancock family business. In the 60s, Lang Hancock said that you should actually control the media and educate the public. And that's what's happening here.
Steve Gibbons, one of your Labor colleagues, has issued a notice of motion that calls for legislation to oversee standards of news behaviour with significant sanctions. Is much tougher regulation the answer? And Doug, newspapers are different, aren't they, in the regulation space, that they're not like broadcasters on the public airwaves?
Yeah. That's right, but I just think the standards of some of the reporting in this country has been abysmal. It's quite clear that the Murdoch press, the Australian, is all about a voice for the most powerful people in this country. If the Age and the Sydney Morning Herald simply become an echo of the Australian, then there will be no media diversity in this country.
Michaelia, do you think there's any case for looking at tougher regulation for the media, rolling in newspapers to the sort of regulation that applies to the broadcast media?
Absolutely not. We believe in freedom of the press and it should stand as it is. I do, though, need to respond to an issue that Senator Cameron raised in relation to his comment that Mrs Rhinehart is going to try and influence the media from a right-wing perspective. To date, Mrs Rhinehart hasn't made a statement. To date, everything that has been said about her is pure conjecture. Right down to the letter that has been written by the journalist employed at Fairfax, who state in their letter, whether there is any truth to these reports, we do not know.
Do you know if she's the sort of person who would like to run an agenda through the media, or is she looking at an investment that might grow over time?
I think when the Fairfax share price has dropped from $5 to 60 cents, I would think there are a few people out there who would be very grateful that Mrs Rhinehart is actually taking a chance on them and giving them much needed funds.
We might move on to the issue of same-sex marriage. Doug, there are reports the vote is being brought forward to August with more time being allotted for debate in order to get the issue over and done with because of concerns in the right wing of your party. Is that the case?
I've heard those arguments. I don't support that. I think there should be an ongoing debate and a proper process within the Parliament to deal with this issue. This is the last big issue of discrimination against any group in the community. If people love each other, if they want to get married, they should be allowed to get married. And I just think the campaign by some of the churches is, really back into the medieval ages.
Do you accept, though, the legislation is likely to be lost this time round, and will those people who want same-sex marriage have to wait a period of time until community attitudes are such as politicians would feel comfortable voting for it? Well,
the community attitude is ahead of the Parliament. It's the Conservative people in Parliament that don't want to go down this path. It's clear that the coalition have bound their MPs and senators. This is something they claim that doesn't happen in the coalition, but there are gay MPs who will be MPs on the coalition side who will be voting against gay marriage.
Michaelia, do you think there will be a time when community attitudes have changed enough to allow politicians from both sides to feel comfortable with voting for same-sex marriage?
Lyndal, unlike the Labor Party, the Coalition made a commitment to the people at the last election. Our position in relation to gay marriage is very clear. We support marriage in its traditional form. We will not breach our faith with the Australian people, unlike the Labor Party, and the vote should be brought on so that we can take it.
And under your party's rules, though, MPs, backbench MPs or senators could cross the floor if they wanted to?
Absolutely, absolutely. That's a fundamental difference between the Liberal Party and the Labor Party.
And are you aware of any that may cross the floor and vote for the same-sex marriage legislation?
We know.
All right, we might move on to one final issue. There have been a range of government and opposition frontbenchers giving speeches to the CEDA conference, the Committee for Economic Development conference. Today, Tony Abbott told the conference that it will be harder for the coalition to find savings this time round.
But as you know from your experience in business, a business which can't save 5% from its expenditure is a business which is not seriously trying to economise. There are 20,000 more public servants on the Commonwealth payroll now than there were at the end of 2007.
Michaelia, Tony Abbott mentioned there that there are 20,000 more public servants on the payroll than there were when Labor came to power. Labor disputes that and says it's actually only 11,000. You've committed to cutting 12,000 people from the public service, but is 20,000 actually the number you're looking at? Because it does come up in coalition speeches again and again.
No, look, good point, Lyndal. We are committed to the promise we made at the last election, which was by natural attrition, we will reduce the numbers in the Commonwealth Public Service by 12,000. The point that our leader was making today was there is way in excess of 12,000 jobs that have been created within the public service. So certainly in relation to our commitment by natural attrition to reduce the public service, it is still at 12,000. However, certainly, if there was scope to look at whether or not further jobs could be lost by natural attrition, then potentially. But certainly our commitment at this stage is only in relation to the 12,000.
Because Mr Abbott made the point that savings will be harder to find this time around because there's not the stimulus spending. So you could look at the public service for those to find
our
some
commitment
of the
is quite clear. We are going to be looking at government very, very carefully to see where savings can be found. We have to make huge savings, Lyndal, to actually clean up the mess that this government has created. But our commitment is the commitment we took to the 2010 election, 12,000. And the point I'd make on that, though, is even if we reduce the public service by 12,000, it only takes us back to 2007. And the numbers will still be higher than what it was when we left office, when Lindsay Tanner himself said a Labor government would take a meat axe to the public service. So this is not something that the coalition talks about. It's something that needs to be done across government.
Doug, your government has been trimming and trimming and trimming the public service by pushing on efficiency dividend after efficiency dividend. Aren't you achieving the same thing by different means?
Well, I don't agree with the ongoing efficiency dividends when it starts to eat into the services to the public. My view is that, we need a complete rethink of the tax base in this country. I mean, it was completely decimated under the incompetence of John Howard and Peter Costello. They've got no credibility, and this so-called economic team in the coalition have got even less credibility. So they've got a $70 billion hole that they're going to have to fill, and they're going to do that by people's lives and people's jobs.
But if you're saying you need to rethink the tax base, then your side has a problem too, doesn't it?
Yeah, I think everyone's got a problem in terms of the tax base in the country. I mean, it's got a structural deficit in place, started by John Howard and his incompetence. So what we need to do is deal with those issues and make sure that we actually have enough tax coming in to build a decent society in this country.
Michaelia, Doug mentioned the $70 billion figure. Tony Abbott said, you should be able to find 5% of the budget. That Penny Wong says adds up to $70 billion. Is the $70 billion figure still alive?
Lyndal, I'm very sorry. When you want to talk about John Howard and Peter Costello, let's talk about $22 billion in surplus, let's talk about zero debt, and let's talk about a future fund. And then let's compare apples with apples.
Like
this government is an economic disaster, and the sooner they call an election, the better for the Australian people.
And that's where we'll run out of time. Michaelia Cash and Doug Cameron, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.
And thank you for joining Capitol Hill. Please be with us at the same time tomorrow. Good night.